patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 133 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Thank you all so much for joining me for this solo episode. You'll be covering elections today, but not just any election. A very, very strange and just honestly one of the craziest elections you will ever hear about. But first, before we get to our main topic for today, as a kind reminder, make sure to subscribe to our Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. Once again, a big thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter, and if you donate at least $10 a month, you will receive a free Friends and Fellow Citizens mug. We are trying to roll out some more mugs in our inventory here, so make sure to check out our Patreon link down in the show notes below. You can also subscribe to our email list, also linked in the show notes. Now, since it's November and we're 1 year away from our next presidential election, 1 year from the time of this episode's release, I thought it would be interesting to look around and peer through the news, and there's just so much about how there's so many different candidates. It seems like with every single election, there's always going to be a lot of different candidates, a lot of different visions, certainly a lot more different candidates for the Republican side. But just in general, I've always felt that there are just so many different candidates, and I thought it would be nice to look and see, has there been an election where there have been way too many candidates for anyone to track? And there is one in history, and I'm so surprised that it's not covered to some degree in civics or history classes, because it really is a fascinating examination, not just on how many candidates there were, but on the fact that perhaps this feeling that we're not voting for someone nowadays, we're voting against someone, the fact that feeling has been around for so long here in the United States. We're going to go back in time to the year 1835. This is the year before the next election of the election of 1836 for a new president, because Andrew Jackson is the incumbent president, and he is quite popular across the United States, really branding himself as a more of a self-made man, as someone not just representing people, but having been one of the people himself years ago. He decided to follow the normal precedent set at the time of 2 terms, and so he decides to hand the reins to his vice president, Martin Van Buren. And I say 1835 just because 1835, 1836, this is really where all this campaigning, all these primaries are happening, and when the conventions are happening as well. And it's pretty clear with Andrew Jackson and his allies, they've been able to nominate Martin Van Buren, and they have Richard Mentor Johnson as the vice presidential candidate. Sounds like it's a pretty normal-ish presidential election, doesn't it? Well, not so much. You see, for all these years, Jackson had been such a leading figure of the Democratic Party. He helped co-founded this new party, and there was clearly a lot of opposition to the Jacksonian policies. The big beef really with Jackson was that he was consolidating so much unitary power within the presidency. And one name we might have heard of before, named Henry Clay, founded a new party called the Whig Party. Whig, which not in terms of the fake hair, right? The Whig, W-H-I-G, the Whig Party was formed mainly as a coalition going against Jacksonian policies. Now, there were 4 other things, right? It was a combination of different factions. There was a huge anti-slavery faction, obviously. But nonetheless, the Whig Party came about, and they became a very, very big force against Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party. they started to gain a lot more momentum in the Congress, and they eventually became the second largest party in that institution. Nonetheless, the Whig Party had a bit of an organizational problem, and you can probably tell where this is going. When a party has an organizational problem, it generally means that it has absolutely no idea who they're going to nominate for president. And the Whigs had this very big problem. They had a lot of good people in their perspective, and with the benefit of hindsight, I think they did have some good candidates, but they just couldn't agree on one. And not only could they not have found one, they didn't even have a convention. So that's a bit of a crazy sort of idea to say, well, let's have a party. Well, we don't know who we're to nominate. It kind of seems like that's a bit of the feeling nowadays among the two big parties, where there seems like to be a lot of opposition and a lot of disdain towards the incumbent nominees. But imagine a brand new party and absolutely having no idea what it's doing when it comes to picking a candidate, even if it's not the perfect candidate. They couldn't even get around someone. So the Whigs had a fantastic idea. This is a bit of a play on with the divide and conquer strategy, but it's weird. They decided to nominate not one, not two, not three, but 4 different candidates for president of the United States. Now you might be thinking, what the heck is going on here? Why are they picking 4 people? Why can't they just pick one? Well, I would say William Henry Harrison, who was from Ohio, obviously a former general, formerly the Anti-Masonic Party as well. He was very much, I think, a favorite for a number of Whig Party members. So he would become one of the bigger candidates, so to speak, and he would actually be on the ballots for enough states to potentially win the general election. However, he was not alone. Clearly, there were people in the Whig Party who wanted to find a way, just any way, to defeat Martin Van Buren. That was really the ultimate goal. It wasn't really about boosting anyone in particular in the Whig Party. This clearly was an anti-Jackson, anti-Van Buren, anti-Democratic Party election. William Henry Harrison ran in a number of different states. The second candidate was Hugh L. White, who is originally from Tennessee. He was actually a very loyal Jacksonian for many, many years. But for a number of these former Democrats, however, people like Hugh White, he was not very pleased with how powerful Jackson had become, seeing how the office of the presidency had grown so much, and certainly him and himself, as a former senator from Tennessee. Well, actually, he was still a senator when he was running. But you can imagine as a senator, when you see the power of the presidency in your mind growing, you feel that your power is being diminished. And that's kind of the similar sentiment that Hugh White felt with Jackson. And he eventually not only left the Democratic Party, but there were a number of efforts to actually oust him from government, with Polk later on trying to basically kick him out, and took over the Tennessee state legislature. I mean, this is partisanship at its highest level, in that time. And once again, it shows that, as much as partisanship and polarization is still an issue nowadays, you can imagine that those times people were not so friendly when it came to political parties. Not to mention this early competition, which hadn't resulted in the Democrat versus Republican nature that we see nowadays. However, nonetheless, because the Whig Party gained so much momentum and people like White were trying to lead the party and create a new coalition, that there was so much of this partisanship happening from both sides of the aisle. Now, the next candidate would have been Daniel Webster, so the third candidate for the Whig Party. Now, Webster did not run in a lot of states. In fact, Webster and Mangum actually ran on single state tickets. So imagine the Whigs were kind of saying, okay, let's look at this map here. We've got Harrison as kind of our, in quotation marks, main man, like the guy who actually, not named Martin Van Buren, who actually has a chance at winning. Then you got White. It's like, well, White can do the southern states, Webster was a big name in Massachusetts, so he was tasked to run in Massachusetts. And the fourth candidate for the Whigs was Willie Parson Mangum, who ran, so his home state was North Carolina, but he ran in South Carolina, also on a single state ticket. Not only did the Whigs thought it would be a fantastic idea to have 4 presidential candidates, how about we screw everything up and run even some more than one vice presidential candidates? And that's exactly what they did. Francis Granger was kind of also, in quotation marks, the main vice presidential candidate, the guy who, not named Richard M. Johnson, had a chance at winning. He ran on the ticket with Harrison. John Tyler, who would ultimately become vice president and ultimately president, not by election, but by the passing of William Henry Harrison in 1841. But John Tyler ran with White, Webster, and Mangum. So you had 3 vice presidential candidates and 5 presidential candidates in this election. Of course, the big issue is slavery. Richard M. Johnson, by the way, was not actually a very popular person in the Democratic Party. Now, some people say that it's because he slept with an African-American woman. While that certainly was true, that he did do that, but that wasn't really the main source of opposition. It was the fact that he was open to admit that he was with that woman and had children with him. Of course, that didn't resonate very well with the Southern voters, particularly those in the Democratic Party. And so a very, very fierce election. So the idea that the Whigs were running all these people to try and stop Van Buren, ultimately their goal was to basically divide and conquer enough so that Van Buren wouldn't win as many states, and therefore, per the Constitution, the election would go to the House of Representatives. Now, the Democrats still control the House of Representatives. However, it would have been, I think, a much more divisive fight. And it's one of those alternate history kind of wonders of what would have happened if this election had gone the way of the Whigs, where Van Buren probably would have likely gotten plurality of votes, but not win the 50% that you need. And that would go to the House. I think it would have been a total bloodbath, to be honest. And I do think, ultimately probably Van Buren might have won because of that. However, it probably would have gotten a lot messier. Probably would have had more deals cut, within Democratic factions. I wonder if that would have created even more fissures in the Democratic Party. That is not, unfortunately, how it happened. The result of the election, Martin Van Buren wins the election with 170 electoral votes. And he wins this election, which was held November 3rd to December 7th, 1836. Turnout was about 57%. Van Buren received 50.8% of the popular vote. So this was actually a lot closer than people thought. In fact, had Van Buren lost Pennsylvania, which he only won by a couple points, this would actually have been completely for the Whigs in terms of a victory. I put them in quotes because you can't win you can't win a presidential election. You have 4 people running, but it would have been a win for the party. Harrison came in second place with 73 electoral votes. Hugh White 26, Daniel Webster with 14. And Mangum with 11. And so the Whig strategy ultimately failed. This anti-Van Buren, anti-Jacksonian effort did not work at all, in part also because the Democratic Party was a lot more organized, and they kind of also had this bit of a new candidate who had this experience, and so ultimately the Democrats did win this election. But as you can tell, this was pretty crazy. The craziness doesn't even stop there. Richard M. Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, was not a very popular person. In fact, he was not popular enough to even win in this election straight out. He was just 1 vote shy of electoral majority. And so, per the Constitution, the Senate now had to vote for a vice presidential candidate. It was Richard Johnson against Francis Granger, who I just mentioned, the Granger being the Whig candidate. Ultimately, Richard Johnson wins this election primarily on a party line vote. And so this is the only time, actually, that our vice president has been voted on by the Senate because the vice presidential candidate didn't win a majority. Now, looking back at this weird election, and I can't even begin to imagine how some people would feel. I mean, thank goodness they didn't even have social media at the time, because my goodness, this would have been an absolute dumpster fire of political discourse. But you can see with this election that clearly the sentiment of being anti someone is nothing new. And it's not to justify it necessarily. It's just to say that there is some historical precedent. Because talking to people, I realized that there's a lot of discontent with a lot of these candidates, and it's understandable why. I think a lot of people would agree that with the exception of a handful of exceptional presidents, we haven't had a lot of great presidents, certainly a lot of successive great presidents, perhaps, since Eisenhower and JFK. And it's understandable why, because of a number of different factors. Won't list all of them, and certainly it's not an exhaustive list, but partisanship certainly has been a big problem. This distrust in government has certainly grown ballooned in a lot of different ways, and it's almost like government dissatisfaction it's like a creative sort of space where people in power really come up with these crazy ways of growing that dissatisfaction, which without having any regard for the consequences on our democracy. I'd like to leave now with a handful of takeaways here. The first, as I alluded to earlier, is that we do have this history of people voting for the sake of voting against instead of voting for someone. And I'm not going to spend this episode explaining whether or not people should vote against someone instead of voting for someone. However, I do think there's a couple things. The first is that when you stand for something, you find yourself a lot more on offense, because when you put yourself there, you put yourself with these new ideas, you share with people about new possibilities that could come about. You share with them about things that maybe you're satisfied with. Maybe there's certain elements of the law or of certain policies that you are largely satisfied with, but you need to make modifications. Maybe you're building on something that was done by your party. It could be something that was done on a bipartisan level, but that you want to elevate that to a different level and make some things better in our community. Whatever it is, I personally am more of an advocate for voting for someone instead of against someone. This is just a personal opinion. I do understand, however, why some people feel that they need to vote against someone. I do think it's particularly justified when that person is exhibiting very, very, very radical and honestly out of touch ideas, and as well as behavior too. Not to mention that people who are running in these races, it's not just the policies and the ideology, it's also how they behave as human beings. And I'll use a personal example as a way to illustrate this. Last year in 2022, I voted in the elections for my home state, the state of Nevada. I voted largely on party lines because I looked at every single candidate that ran for these certain offices, and I was pleased in general. I may not have been the biggest fan of a lot of these people in terms of even knowing who they are. I didn't even meet these people beforehand in the first place. But there were 3 statewide offices where I voted differently than the county I was in and the way my party voted. For one position, I didn't like either of the candidates. I thought both candidates were honestly out of their mind, and I didn't think that they exhibited a lot of good professional qualities. And so I didn't vote. I chose none of these candidates, which in Nevada, you cannot write in a candidate. So really, if it's not Democrat, Republican, or an independent or a third party, it's none of these candidates. So I thought I voted for none of these candidates. The other 2, I crossed party lines and I voted for the nominee from the other party. It was not because I agree with most of what that person or that party represented or wanted to implement. I had a lot of grievances about the other party. I didn't think that a lot of their policies had any chance of making things better in my state. However, these particular candidates I was very impressed with, even though I had these disagreements. But for the position of the treasurer and for the attorney general, I voted for the candidate who ultimately, both of them actually ultimately won. So that was nice. It's nice to vote for people who will ultimately win. I decided to do that because the candidates who were running against him were just absolutely awful. One of them made a reference to a noose, particularly to an opponent who was African American. There was also another opponent who really honestly just exhibits no sort of stability. And I cannot vote for someone who, in my mind, can't even be stable, can't even stop for a second to think before you say something. And I still tell people within people in my own party how I voted in that election. It's certainly one thing to say that every single person I voted for won except for one. So I maybe almost won the jackpot, I guess. But that's not really the main story. The main story is the reason why I voted the way I did. And I hope that people who voted differently than maybe expected, I hope that they're more vocal, because these are really key, valuable lessons. These are lessons about candidate quality. These are lessons about voting for people who have integrity, even if you don't agree with everything. And we all want to have people with good character and good integrity. If you recall from an episode a while ago when we were speaking with a guest, Phil Katsros, about the Nevada Game Control Board, he was saying how even when you are a gaming operator, there is still an expectation you need to have some kind of good quality of character and integrity. Why can't we have that same thing when we vote for candidates? And so, yes, there was an element of voting against someone by not voting for them, I guess. However, I think there's always more to the story. And so, on the other thing I'd like to add to this first big takeaway of how we have a history of people voting against people instead of voting for someone is that there might be more to the story. And so when we ask people, say, well, why didn't you vote for this candidate from our party? I think we need to be more curious about why people vote that way. Maybe there's a good lesson. Maybe we're not really understanding the key issues that even party members wanted to know about or want to be represented in their legislature or in their government. Being active in listening to why people defect from their party on particular candidates or particular policies, those I think the party needs to understand. They need to read and see what is going on here. What can we learn from this? That, I hope, is something that could potentially grow as partisanship and polarization become an increasingly big issue. And it's already a huge issue now. But especially if parties want to win elections, they need to learn those lessons. And they need to be able to have those guts to stand for what is right. The second takeaway is I do hope that people will vote with their conscience throughout these primaries and through into the election, which is a year from the episode that is being released now, but it's going to happen. It's going to come before you know it. And I would say for every single election, that is the case. Elections do come very, very quickly. It's astonishing how fast time flies. And I always encourage people to vote with your conscience, but also seek unity. What that means is you might be supporting a candidate who you really love, you're absolutely dedicated to. Depends on the circumstances, okay? But if you're a member of a party, you should also encourage your candidate. If that candidate loses and loses by a mile, if that person should consider thinking about the larger collective victory and say to themselves, you know what, my candidate didn't win, but I'm going to coalesce around a solid candidate. And when I say solid candidate, I don't just mean the candidate who wins, right? But I also hope that people will say, no, I'm going to go around this camp because, one, I believe that my party needs to win, right? Or I think it's good for the community or good for the state or good for the country. But it's also got to be a solid candidate. It's got to be a candidate who knows how to rally a group of people together. For nonpartisans, it's certainly different, but I also hope that even for nonpartisans, that they can find a candidate who is say, you know what, these people, they may not be perfect, but they exemplify characteristics that we are looking for in this community. So voting for your conscience is something that I encourage. However, sometimes you need a compromise. Sometimes you need to realize, what is the larger win for my state or for my country? It should never, ever be picking the perfect candidate, because the perfect candidate never exists. I've told people many times, and I still do, that I'm interested in running for office, but I will tell you, I will never be a perfect candidate. It's just the way it is. It's just being human. There's always going to be someone who says, oh, Sherman's just not conservative enough on these issues, or Sherman's not liberal enough on these issues, or Sherman is just not whatever. There's always going to be something. It could be something as silly as, Sherman doesn't support blueberry pies as much as I want to. Something like that. There's always going to be someone who's just never going to be 100% satisfied. But the way you go about things is not to cater to a small number of people. It's not just to cater to a small number of donors. It's to figure out what is in the interest of the constituency and of the office that I'm running for. And I know that a lot of people are very dissatisfied with a lot of the candidates. And so I encourage other people, good candidates. We need good candidates in general. We can't just have one good candidate. We got to have many. We got to have a lot of good candidates. I always think back to the election of 1800. The choice at the time was John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. It's not that neither of those candidates are perfect, but it's that these are quality candidates. They disagree on a lot of things, and anyone who hears anything about the election of 1800 knows just how absolutely divisive that election was. Divisive is an understatement. But it's the fact that people want to go back. I do think that a lot of people want to go back to a time when they could have an actual choice of good quality candidates. Perhaps it requires people to step up. Perhaps it requires encouraging your friend, your colleague, or whoever who may never have run for office, or maybe has been in office for a very long time, but has never maybe run for a particular position. Encourage those people. Talk to them. Throughout this primary cycle and through the elections that are going to occur, and everyone's going to say, this is the most important election. Well, of course it's the most important election, because it's the next one. It's the next one that we're going to be able to vote for. So of course this is the most important election. And regardless of how important these elections are, what is most important perhaps is the ability, the freedom for people to vote with their conscience, but also to do so with the intent of uniting others. It's not to change people's minds necessarily. It's not to satisfy every single person in their constituency, but it's to deliver a common win, or at least to know that people have an opportunity to participate in politics in a more civil manner, to allow a greater political participation for people whose voices haven't been heard. These are the kinds of objectives that I hope we can achieve. We can certainly at least know, at least nowadays, and hopefully I'm not talking too soon, but hopefully we are not at a point where we have to rerun the election of 1836 again. And God help us if we were to get to that point. But it's a very, very good lesson on the value of picking good candidates. It's the value of having some kind of unity, whether it's party unity if you are a member of a party, or perhaps unity within your constituency if you are a nonpartisan. I hope that these lessons are helpful for you, and these are going to be themes that we're going to be exploring more in this podcast. It is not an end-all be-all when I speak about these issues, but I just hope that in the spirit of the primary season coming up so soon, and for the general election to occur before you know it, 1 year sounds like a lot, but it's not. Hopefully we can keep these in mind as we go on with our day-to-day lives and as we participate in our American political system today. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about the election of 1836 and how we should never ever repeat that election ever again, and as well as some of the takeaways about voting and elections. Make sure to check the links down in the show notes below for more information on how to become a Patreon member, subscribe to our podcast. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.